today, and we're open to taking your calls at 516-572-7440. And we are talking about herbs, since this is Herbal Yours, and two of the things that you probably are using, which are herbs, and you may not even realize it, and that is chocolate and coffee. What have you heard? Are those really, really bad sins, or are they actually wonderful health-giving substances? Well, there's two sides to every story, but the research is really backing the nutritive effects of these two, what I call pleasures. So let's talk a little bit about coffee. Coffee has less than 3 calories a cup, a trace of protein and fat, and does not have fiber, but it has no sugar, according to the USDA Nutrient Data Laboratory. A cup of standard coffee has about 95 milligrams of caffeine, and we're going to talk about caffeine in a little while, since that's one of the things that actually might not be so good for you. Coffee is the second most consumed beverage after water around the world, according to the Critical Review in Science, in Food Science and Nutrition Journal. Coffee, because of its rich phytochemistry, can reduce the risk of developing type 2 diabetes, some kinds of cancer, degenerative illnesses like Alzheimer's or Parkinson's, and temporarily make you more alert. Well, most people know about that more alert part, and that, in fact, is why they are often using coffee. So it's pretty amazing that coffee is basically a 0 calorie. That's if you drink it black. If you're putting in tons of sugar, if you're using artificial sweeteners, I suggest you stop immediately. What I tell many of my patients who are looking to add natural therapeutics to their life for many different reasons, and they always want to know, do I have to give up my coffee? And I'll tell them, you know what? Not really, as long as you use organic coffee and don't add a lot of sugar, and never use artificial sweetener. So if you don't like the taste of coffee black, a good sweetener to use would be something like maple syrup. Maple syrup really blends beautifully with coffee and is quite healthy. It has its own natural nutritional components that actually enhance the coffee. I personally don't need any sweetener in it, but if you do, another good choice would be stevia. Stevia is you can grow in your yard, by the way. If you're a local listener here on Long Island, you can grow stevia right in your yard. It grows like a mint plant, and you can use the leaves. So recent research has shown that coffee may help prevent stroke and also lower the risk of Parkinson's and dementia, as well as boosting concentration and memory. That's pretty good. That's because coffee beans are seeds. And the National Institute of Health, that's the NIH, reminds us that, like all seeds, coffee beans have a lot of protective compounds. Coffee is an amazingly potent collection of biologically active compounds, as we mentioned earlier. And this is a quote right from Walter Willett, MD. He's the head of Harvard School of Public Health, and he was discussing this in the National Institute of Health newsletter. Also, he talked about caffeine and the fact that that is a mild stimulant, but also provides health benefits. And by the way, caffeine is found in both our topics for today, coffee and chocolate. And we are going to talk about some of the downsides of caffeine as well, because, you know, everything is a double-edged sword, and some people are more sensitive to caffeine than others. So although it has all these wonderful health benefits, you have to be aware of some of the downsides of caffeine. And also, you need to know if you yourself are sensitive, because some people get digestive difficulties, they get stomach aches and other kinds of digestive difficulties when they're using too much caffeine or they're drinking too much coffee. And also in terms of insomnia. And by the way, that can happen with chocolate as well. But we want to remind you that you're listening to Herbally Yours on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC. I'm Ellen Kamhi, the natural nurse, and my guest today is myself because we're discussing things with you, the audience. We'll take your calls if you'd like to call in at 516-572-7440, and we're right here in the studio at Nassau Community College 90.3 and on iHeartRadio, which is, I think, just a wonderful extension to the voice here of WHPC. So isn't it exciting that you actually can downgrade your possibility of getting Alzheimer's by using things like coffee and chocolate? It's because a lot of those things they actually help circulation to the brain. Now, we know also that the American Chemical Society found that specific microbes in our gut convert a portion of the caffeine and the other components, both in coffee and chocolate, into anti-inflammatory compounds. And this is probably the link, that decrease in inflammation is probably the link to its positive effects on things like memory. As for coffee, we talked about Cornell University, but let's talk about, unfortunately, some of the other downsides of caffeine and also how much is too much, right? Well, a lot of people are getting a lot of caffeine because, let's say, they are having tea. Tea, by the way, even green tea contains caffeine. There are many other herbs that contain caffeine, like guarana, mate, yerba mate, you might have heard of. And the thing is, these things are also added to energy drinks. I'm wondering if any of you are aware of the fact that energy drinks are actually having some legal problems now because the caffeine content is so high, but they are being actively promoted for younger people to use. And very often, teachers I know have told me that kids in junior high school and maybe even in grammar school come in with energy drinks. Energy drinks have a much more concentrated amount of caffeine than a regular cup of coffee or a chocolate bar. But many people do know that coffee contains caffeine, but they're really not aware that chocolate also contains caffeine. So if you like, let's say, chocolate ice cream, and you have it sometime in the evening, and then you find that you're having difficulty falling asleep or staying asleep, that might be due to too much caffeine, because caffeine is clearly linked to insomnia. That is one of the problems with it. Also, nervousness. Nervousness is another thing that can happen with caffeine. So you really have to watch how much caffeine are you ingesting. If you're someone who suffers from anxiety, a lot of people find they actually shake and have a much higher level of anxiety after using caffeine, as well as the disruption to sleep patterns, which leads to a vicious cycle of restless sleep, relying on the caffeine to wake them up more during the day. So this is one of the reasons you need to be careful. Also, caffeine can interact with some medications. If you're on thyroid medication, for instance, or any kind of psychiatric drugs or drugs for depression and anxiety, caffeine can interact with them. Also, even antibiotics such as Cipro and the heartburn drug Tagamet. That's something that you need to know about because it can increase blood sugar levels, making it harder for those with type 2 diabetes to manage their insulin. So there you go. It's all about balance. So if you're having 1 or 2 cups of good quality coffee a day, or a good quality dark chocolate bar, that's great. One of the things I would suggest, especially for those who know they have a caffeine sensitivity, is to ingest these things early in the day, which is certainly the norm. Many people who enjoy coffee, like myself, I actually have organic coffee made at home. I use not a white filter. You know, the white filters, if you're making your own coffee at home, those white filters are loaded with dioxin. That's a particular toxic chemical bleach that leaches right out of that white paper. However, such an easy thing to change, because in every single grocery store they sell the brown undyed filters. Very, very easy to use instead. So you can just use that instead. Then there's no dioxin. You can use filtered water, organic coffee, and then if you like cream, if you're not milk sensitive, you can use milk. Otherwise, soy milk or almond milk work very, very well in coffee. And then a good sweetener, as we talked about, would be maple syrup or also organic raw honey. Wow, what a difference. And you know, the amount of caffeine in each kind of coffee can also vary depending on the brew and the beverage size. For instance, espresso has up to 75 milligrams of caffeine, while instant coffee can have anywhere between 27 and 150 milligrams. Do people still use instant coffee? I don't know. Yes, we're getting the head engineer's intake on that. I haven't seen people using it as much. I know my mom actually always liked instant coffee. Typical brewed coffee varies between 100 and 200 milligrams, while some of the commercial brands, which I'm not going to name, starts with an S, take a guess, that has coffee up to 330 milligrams per cup. And, you know, when they're talking about a cup, they're talking about a giant mug, which is really more like 3 cups. So there's a real variation there, and all of these caffeine counts were brought to you by the Mayo Clinic. So I think you're understanding that actually there's a balance, that chocolate and coffee have some of the best brand new science supporting their use for health. And then also, you don't want to overdo it, because increased caffeine can cause insomnia and anxiety. So also, not really for children. We don't want to be overstimulating children with coffee or chocolate, right? So we want to use everything sort of in moderation. Then when we're using chocolate, we don't want to load up on the sugar, the chemicals, the emulsifiers, the flavoring agents. So one of the best things is, as always, read your labels. So I want to thank you so much for joining us today, reminding you that you're listening to Herbally Yours on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC. Listen live or online at ncc.edu. Or you can email us at whpc@ncc.edu. This is your host, Ellen Kamhi at naturalnurse.com, inviting you to join us next week for another edition of Herbally Yours. Until then, stay healthy.